Spring Miller, and I am the Assistant Dean for Public Interest here at Vanderbilt Law School. It is great to see you all here for today's event, which is part of the Dean's Lecture Series on Race and Discrimination. We are so thrilled to have with us today Seon Song, Assistant Professor at the University of California, Irvine School of Law. Professor Song is a criminal and juvenile law expert whose scholarship focuses on race and class-based disparities in the criminal legal system. As we will hear from her directly in a moment, her recent work has focused in particular on the intersection of healthcare and law enforcement systems and the deployment of policing authority in hospital settings. Professor Song's scholarship draws on her years of experience as a public and juvenile defender. She represented youth and adults as a deputy public defender at the Contra Costa County Office of the Public Defender and as a Prettyman Fellow at Georgetown University Law Center. She also worked as a senior policy advocate for the National Juvenile Defender Center. Prior to joining UC Irvine, Professor Song served as a Thomas Gray Fellow and lecturer in law at Stanford Law School, where she developed a large research project on policing in hospital settings. As part of her research and interventions around these issues, Professor Song created a working group on policing and patient rights with Georgetown University Law Center's Health Justice Alliance. She regularly conducts trainings for and consults with medical providers on the intersection of medical care and policing. Professor Song earned her BA and JD from Columbia Law School, as well as an LLM from Georgetown, and she clerked for the late Honorable Deborah Batts of the Southern District of New York. We are so grateful she is joining us virtually today to talk with us about her work on hospitals as carceral settings. And with all that, I will turn it over to her now. We've asked her to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes in order to leave plenty of time for your questions. If you are participating virtually, you can put those questions in the chat. And if you're with us here in person, you can let Jenny know that you'd like to submit a question. Okay, I'll turn it over to you, Professor Song. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you so much, Dean Miller, for that introduction. And thank you to Vanderbilt for inviting me to contribute to this really important lecture series on race and discrimination. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person, but I'm happy to be in conversation with you through the magic of Zoom. So how many of you have been to the hospital? You don't have to raise your hands, these are questions that I'm just asking you to think to yourself. And how about the emergency room? I think many of us may have ended up in the emergency room for various reasons. How about jails? Maybe less of us in jails. And then prisons, maybe even less of us in prisons. And so today I'll be talking about these two institutions and systems in our country that have much responsibility for contributing to the inequities of today, the criminal system and the healthcare system. And I will be talking about these two systems at the intersection at one physical point, the hospital. Because hospitals, and here what I mean are hospitals in what I call the free world, are extensions of our carceral institutions and sites. And the problems of mass incarceration cannot remain behind jail and prison walls. They seep beyond electrified fences and cinder blocks and into institutions that at their fundamental purpose is to give and sustain life. But first, how did I get here? As Dean Miller said, for 10 years before I came to academia, I was a public defender. And for a lot of it, I wasn't just a public defender, but a juvenile public defender, meaning I represented young people charged with crimes, both in juvenile and adult court. So my time as a public defender gave me a profound insight into the parts of our criminal legal system that are broken, including parts that are perhaps more hidden from public view. And as a juvenile public defender, I was required to be involved with a lot of different overlapping institutions like schools, group homes, probation offices, mental health institutions, and juvenile and adult detention facilities. The questions that preoccupied me as a former public defender and now as a researcher are how the state deploys power in the name of public safety in ways that increase, exacerbate suffering and dehumanization. And, oh, is my video not on? Sorry. Is it back on?
Oh, you're back on. You're perfect.
Okay. Sorry. This is the craziness of Zoom.
Now. Okay, that's great.
Okay, so I was just a voice in the ether. That's kind of amazing. How the state deploys power in names of public safety in ways that increase, exacerbate suffering and dehumanization, especially in ways that discriminate one racial group, one ethnic group, one class from another. But hospitals didn't figure into my picture of a place where criminal system and carceral authorities extended their power initially. So then how did I arrive at hospitals? And that is through a client I will call CD. It was a late afternoon. I got a call on my phone as I was driving home. I almost ignored it, but conscience got the better of me and I took it. My 15-year-old client was shot by the police. Could I go to the hospital? I was 5 minutes away, and so I said I could. As I drove, I remembered the last time I saw him in a courtroom as he was sent away to a group home where he would later run away from. And as we talked, I remarked on his beautiful, heavy lashed eyes, joking around with him a little as I was trying to get him less nervous about the courtroom proceedings. I thought about that moment as I arrived at the hospital, only to be told by hospital security that the police would not let me in. The police would not let anybody in. Now, I wouldn't take no for an answer. After some heavy persuasion and maybe some legal threats, I made it in. And what I saw shocked me. My 15-year-old client had been shot in the back of the head. He had lost his eye. He was blinded in the other, and in so much pain. Yet what surprised me even more and stuck with me was how apparent it became that the law enforcement had told his medical team a story, that my client was a thwarted cop killer and that he was shot in self-defense. The police had claimed he was under arrest and that he could not be given access to anyone, including me, his lawyer, or his mother. And though I could not determine this exactly, I couldn't help but sense that perhaps the care team was viewing my 15-year-old client differently, as a prisoner and not a deserving patient. I was angry, disturbed, and in the 3 weeks I spent at his bedside, I became more and more confounded by the ease with which law enforcement and correctional authorities flowed within the hospital, and it led me down this journey. So what do I mean by hospitals as extensions of carceral sites? I'm going to talk about it in 3 respects. One, how emergency rooms particularly act as places of police investigation and surveillance. 2, how medical practitioners within hospitals end up as what I call cops in scrubs because of a whole host of laws that tell them to make exceptions to their way of providing patient care because of law enforcement and public safety reasons. And how hospitals diminish dignity, privacy, and at the end of the day, humanity, because they adopt and replicate rules and regulations of carceral settings. Throughout these discussions, I highlight the serious race implications as we talk about these 2 institutions. Now, my work builds off this work of other scholars, from those that described how hospitals and asylums replicate and mimic carceral institutions, and how people, for example, women and women of color, Black women especially, have experienced criminalization in healthcare settings. But my work takes a concrete term to examine the law, the legal underlay that I say that allows this carceralization of hospitals and the policies and practices that demonstrate that carceralization. So first, why am I talking about emergency rooms? I highlight them for 3 primary reasons. So emergency rooms are widely used in our healthcare system. They have become the safety net healthcare for people who are low income and minority. This particular subset of our population also overlaps with the groups that are subject to the most policing and most vulnerable to abuses of policing. Emergency rooms are, of course, places where people go when they're injured as a result of crime. So police may accompany them. Police may get called in by police officers who sometimes act as security in those emergency rooms. And emergency rooms are also where jails and prisons take their incarcerated when they need medical help. And now we know, because jail and prison healthcare are notoriously riddled with problems. And so these external hospitals and emergency rooms end up becoming the safety net, not just for us generally, but for the carceral system as well. And in these emergency rooms, police are given fairly free access to patients, their belongings, inpatient care spaces. They're given access to question and interrogate patients even as they're undergoing major trauma interventions. Police also ask medical providers to conduct cavity searches, like rectal and vaginal exams for them, including invasive procedures to retrieve perceived contraband that a prisoner might be holding. And part of why this access is so freely given is on the courts. Now, you may have studied in criminal procedure or con law that courts can circumscribe police power through the interpretation of our constitutional rights. Here I'm talking about the Fourth Amendment rights against searches and seizures, the Fifth Amendment right against privilege against self-incrimination, and relevant here, but to a lesser degree, the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Yet, in these emergency rooms where people go when they are most vulnerable, courts discount that vulnerability in their adjudication of constitutional rights. They proclaim by and large that emergency rooms are public spaces where law enforcement have free access. They also talk about how medical providers act as gatekeepers and point to how they freely let them in. And not only that, but courts expect and affirm medical providers' participation in policing as a kind of good citizenship. So that is when they provide information to police about patients, ignoring ethics and duties that medical providers would otherwise owe to their patients. So courts have essentially extended the public street into the emergency room. But the emergency room are extensions of the street only to the police. I'll give an example. In one of my observations of an ED, a woman inadvertently came in through the trauma bay with a gunshot wound. She had flagged down a hospital employee getting off of shift. He keyed her in. And so she bypassed all the formal structures that you need to do to get from outside into the trauma bay. And all the doctors and nurses around me wondered aloud, how did she get in? At the same time, I saw more than 10 law enforcement agents of different agencies flood into the space immediately. Only one of them was asking questions of this Black woman who had been shot. The others were milling around in an area with hospital beds full. And then at some point, the questioning of the patient stopped as the doctors were working on her. And then they were kind of hanging around and then finally left. But what struck me was while everybody was asking how the woman got in, past those official checks, no one asked why those law enforcement agents were there, how they got in, and why all of them of different agencies had to be there. So by extending the street into the emergency room for police, the courts have really only extended it for police. And they have also extended the problems of policing into the emergency room. So including the problems of racialized policing, where police can exercise their biases, but now in places where people are physically vulnerable and face an impossible choice: get care or be policed. And hospitals have also become carceral sites because of this asymmetrical power dynamic between the professionals at this intersection. So law enforcement and carceral authorities on one hand and medical professionals on another. So let me give you another example to explain this dynamic. On another night, I was observing an ED shift. I donned some borrowed scrubs, so I guess I kind of looked like either a med student or a resident. And I came out of the bathroom to find the chief resident, a Black man, and he was eagerly waiting for me. "I'm so glad you're here," he said. "I'm having such major problems." And so as he explained to me, and I saw, a sheriff's deputy had brought in a man from the local jail. He had cysts all over his face. The resident had asked the deputy to step aside to give him and the patient privacy. The deputy blanketly refused, and I could tell that whatever had happened before me had been quite tense. But so I stood by and watched as the deputy stood there with the patient and the doctor who's providing care. Deputy standing close the entire time. The resident had lost the battle. But then there's a coda to this, because as soon as the chief resident left and I was left in my borrowed scrubs in the room with the patient, the deputy simply just walked away. So whatever the reasons had been given for why he had to be there in the moment of that patient care interaction had somehow dissipated as soon as the resident had left. So what we see in the hospitals are not just that the ED, though, has this imbalance of power, but and it's not just an imbalance just in this practicality and this like day-to-day instant encounter, but it's an asymmetry based in laws. So how many of you believe that your conversations with your doctor are private? How many of you rely on that privacy? We are told that we have, sometimes people call it colloquially, HIPAA privacy rights, that there is patient-provider confidentiality and privilege. There's evidentiary privileges attached to it. But in the context of medical professionals and law enforcement, there are a slew of laws and obligations that tell medical providers that they can, should, and must comply with law enforcement. And there's no corresponding countervailing authority that medical providers can rely upon, except for their individual ethical and professional determinations to push back against this law enforcement cooperation. This imbalance makes it often untenable for medical providers to do their jobs and leads to situations where perhaps inadvertently they become party to abuses of police authority or broadening of police authority in healthcare spaces. So that's why you see medical providers conduct rectal exams, colonoscopies, sedate patients to look for drugs that aren't there because law enforcement asks them to. They medically clear patients, which is a complete carceral term of art for incarceration, even though jails and prisons are often very dangerous places and not healthy places. And even when they're not, a lot of medical providers are not quite sure what medical clearance means. And this is especially concerning when you think about in the past 2 years, especially that jails and prisons have been known outbreak sites of COVID-19 because they have not followed the CDC guidelines about social distancing, hygiene, masking, etc. So medical providers then have to stand aside while law enforcement rules and protocols are implemented. Like in one hospital where the chief of the ED recounted how he now knows that he has to stand aside if he sees a law enforcement officer punch a patient lying in his bed in the name of a use of force protocol, because the hospital administration has determined that the use of force protocol by law enforcement applies when a patient is a prisoner and not just a patient. So overall, you can see that there might be a great deal of confusion here, right? And there's also a division amongst medical providers about this. So in interviews and review of hospital and law enforcement policies, you see medical professionals, emergency and trauma physicians, also nurses, nurse practitioners, midwives, hospital social workers, routinely speaking of law enforcement interrupting provision of care, being caught in these ethical quandaries, being concerned that they would be perceived of as cooperating with law enforcement, and the lack of understanding by their own administrations. On the other hand, I also saw hospitals and hospitals practitioners and staff who saw themselves much more aligned with law enforcement, seeing public health and public safety missions as identical or close to each other, and who needed to rely upon law enforcement for personal safety and workplace safety. So in more us versus them. Now, this is especially concerning when you think about the already existing mistrust between minority and especially Black and Indigenous communities with the medical profession. So experimentation like the decades-long Tuskegee syphilis study, sterilization of Black women, other kinds of experiments done on Black bodies. And when you consider medicine and their biased reporting of Black pregnant women and their reproductive choices, medicine and their current racial bias, which leads to incorrect treatment or no treatment, and the role medical institutions and professions have played in perpetuating segregation and discrimination in our country's history. So you can see how that mistrust can be compounded even more if doctors and nurses work side by side with law enforcement. One hospital doctor reported that a nurse in his hospital would wear the local police department's shirt on top of her scrubs and wondered how that might appear to patients and how that might deter would-be patients from seeking medical care until it's too late. So I looked at the emergency room. I looked at the relationship between these professionals. But my research and my work with the physicians to try to figure this out led me to look at this on more of an institutional level. At first, I thought perhaps hospital administrations don't have proper incentives, right? There's like no liability if you have patients who are poor, who don't have access to lawyers, who might assert their privacy rights. But then you also see that these hospitals, these free external hospitals, are embedded into our carceral structures in deeply entrenched ways. So then hospital beds have become police cell beds, jail beds, and prison beds. Today, when police and corrections authorities bring people to hospitals, carceral markers of guards, handcuffs, and even separate jumpsuits signal to doctors and nurses that law enforcement controls that person. The world got a glimpse of this authority after Kenosha, Wisconsin police officers shot Jacob Blake 7 times in the back. He survived the shooting and was taken to a hospital. In a press conference, Mr. Blake's family revealed that at first they could not see him, and later when they did, Mr. Blake lay paralyzed and handcuffed to his hospital bed. Kenosha Police Department justified the handcuffs because of an outstanding warrant, a warrant that had been executed shortly after his arrival at the hospital. Handcuffing Mr. Blake struck many people as horribly wrong. Tony Evers, the Wisconsin governor, said he couldn't imagine why Blake was handcuffed. I hope that we would be able to find a better way to help him in recovering, he said. This seems counterintuitive. It seems to be bad medicine. Only after pressure and with the help of the DA did the police vacate the warrant. But the handcuffs were not the only frustration for the family. Hospital rules and the presence of sheriff deputies in Mr. Blake's room further impeded the family's ability to visit and comfort Mr. Blake. But in fact, this example of Mr. Blake's handcuffs, the presence of officers, hospital rules restricting access to family, are hospital business as usual for patients who are perceived or actually prisoners. Throughout the country, individuals in law enforcement custody are in hospitals handcuffed with guards standing watch. In hospitals, then, law enforcement and correctional authority operate by their own rule books. So I've talked about use of force, but also restraints like shackling and guard presence, but other rules as well. So in jails and prisons, if you have been, prisoners or inmates are cut off from others, subject to stringent institutional rules about phone calls and visits that could be cut off for disciplinary reasons or other reasons. But what happens when that person is then under law enforcement custody, but in the free world hospital? Those same rules apply to a large extent. And this is even though medical research shows that family access is vital to the healing process. And even when we know that oftentimes it is our loved ones who make our care decisions, or at least help us make them. And this other aspect of decision-making and the autonomy of patients' decisions to make about their healthcare comes into play here when hospitals become carceral settings. So in one state, there are multiple reports where wardens would bring prisoners who had been injured or sick at their prisons. And then when family members didn't know that they were taken to hospitals until it was too late, and also only to discover that the warden had ordered a DNR, a do not resuscitate order, and family members did not find out until it was too late. This also took place during COVID, where hospitals were and personnel were at a loss of whether they follow prison rules about how to handle end of life and patient care, or whether it was family members. And hospitals may end up then applying their own rules. So you can imagine that this idea of formal custody, whether you're in law enforcement custody or not, is sometimes an ambiguous one. And so in one hospital, in order to deal with that ambiguity, they now have a rule that anybody who is even under perceived law enforcement custody, a different set of rules apply, a different set of rules that even govern the food they get to eat, the bathroom trips that they get to make, as well as the others that I've listed. And part of why, an important reason why hospitals have become this important safety net for prisons and jails and for police agencies is because at the front end, people get injured at arrest, but they have to be taken to the hospital before they can be cleared for the jail. And at the back end, because people get sick and injured in our jails and prisons. The population in our jails and prisons have many health needs exacerbated by conditions of confinement, either through injury or illness. Our jails and prisons provide horrendous care, as you can be seen through the multiple lawsuits you see throughout the country. Many have their own correctional health care, but they are bad, and many times they contract with privatized health companies that have been subject to much controversy. And so some of these solutions have been extreme. So in places like New York City, Los Angeles, Texas, you actually have these, what I'm calling free world hospitals, have physical sites in jails or vice versa. You also have other places where you have formal contracts between hospitals and jails and prisons and police agencies, or more informal practices. But these arrangements are fraught with problems. There's extensions of the problem of dual loyalty in correctional care. So does the doctor have a duty to the law enforcement agency or to the prisoner? And this echoes the triangulated relationships of slave hospitals of the past in the South, where physicians treated patients who were brought in by slave owners or traders so they can then go be made healthy to go back to work on the plantations. And you also have other kind of concerning elements come out. So in one instance, the medical director of a hospital that is a private hospital that also has a jail, it has a unit inside the jail. Whenever I'm dealing with a patient, I imagine that he would slit my throat and kill me if he could. I give him the same level of medical care I would anyone else, but there's no fluffy talk. Imagine the kind of patient-provider care that actually happens in that instance and the perception of the person who's receiving that care. And these arrangements also seem to echo problematic medical practices in the past where Black people were seen as opportunities for experiments. So you see in some other quotes, these cases offering pamphlets saying these cases offer such rich teaching opportunities that schools can actually use them, medical schools can use them as a recruiting tool. So you have one resident physician saying, there's such a diverse range of pathologies amongst prisoners. You get to see pancreatic cancer in a 20-year-old. It's a great asset. And these problems of dual loyalty and potentials for bias in treatment and care exist in these settings, but also in hospitals that don't have these kinds of formalized relationships where you might have jail and hospital in jail. Now, in some ways, this overpowering of law enforcement way of doing business seems counterintuitive. Now, you all should know that, or maybe you do know that hospitals are highly regulated entities. They are subject to many federal and state agencies, police, jails, and prisons far less. And perhaps maybe this is why it's predictable that the less monitored, the less regulated entity triumphs in this space. And the minimal guarantees of care for people in jails and prisons that pass constitutional muster extend as well into the hospital care space. So in sum, what we now have is that our most dehumanizing institutions, law enforcement, the jail or prison, which we really should be thinking about how to restrict in our society, is instead expanding. What should be one of the safest places for a person is now analogous to a poorly lit cell. And instead of eliminating the harms of our incarceration and prison culture, we're allowing those culture and norms to take over other parts of our society. So now that I've drawn this picture though, where can we go? My students often say that whenever they're in my classes, they come out very angry and sad, or both. We are at a critical juncture in our country on major issues, right? We've just seen a confirmation hearing where Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson was subject to attacks because of her time for things such as her time upholding the constitutional right to counsel as a public defender. We're witnessing the growing assault on women's reproductive rights as choices, and that their choices are being criminalized and the health community caught at the crosshairs. And even as police violence seems to have receded from front and center news, killings continue, and media reports on crime increase, and there's backlash against progressive prosecutors, which seem to point to a possible re-entrenchment of problematic practices in the past and rollback on reforms made against policing and mass incarceration. On top of all of that, we are at a time when the country and the world seems wary, but still vulnerable to the unknowns of the future trajectory of COVID-19, while war threatens the global community in ways not seen in some time. So this country and this world seems to be on a precipice where we have choices to make about democracy and about how we can address the continuing legacy of slavery and racial and ethnic discrimination in our nation's history. And there are choices about our state of mass incarceration and policing. choice to regress to policies we know to be wrong in terms of incarcerating and policing, or choices to make our human institutions better. And so I end on a hopeful note that my research is also uncovering a lot of movement and organizing in this realm. There's a lot of emerging research on the effects of policing and law enforcement presence in healthcare settings. There's a lot of organizing amongst medical providers with community partners, medical providers who don't want to be seen as part of or complicit in this system. And ultimately, this has been what's been most exciting and inspiring and motivating about this project. Because yes, my research uncovers harms, uncovers unregulated police discretion. And what viscerally bothers me is ignoring or letting slide by human suffering. But it is also an area where there is change coming and potential for transformational change, not just in healthcare, not just in our criminal legal system, but ultimately in rethinking how we relate to one another, treat each other, no matter our differences or no matter what a person has done. So that is it for my formal comments. I very much look forward to your questions. Please ask as many as possible. I learned so much through this dialogue. Thank you again.
Thank you so much. So I can see in the chat that we have a student question already, and maybe we'll just go with this one. Kaylee, would you like me to read it out loud, or would you like to unmute yourself and submit it? I'll give you a second.
Read it. Sorry, it's kind of loud in here.
No worries. I'm happy to read it too if you get to that point where it feels untenable. Just let me know.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can. Hi, Kaylee.
Hi, thanks so much for being here. I had a question on what remedies we should be seeking for these issues. I think generally like suppression of evidence is the legal remedy for like involuntary statements by people who are accused of crimes, their statements while receiving medical care, usually from injuries inflicted by the police or related to the crime, I guess. But this also pretty much never happens because it's such a hard standard to meet. So I was just wondering if there's other non-carceral solutions that maybe don't involve the legal system that you think we should be advocating for.
Yes, and that's exactly why I have ended up working so much in the medical space, not because I've completely given up on the hope of Fourth Amendment, as you said, but because I think part of what's fascinating me is that I think that there's a lot of power actually coming at it from the medical side. So I was talking to, so I mentioned HIPAA at the very beginning. I was talking to a former HIPAA privacy officer, and she was saying, well, you know, these are technically HIPAA privacy violations, which could lead to a lot of enforcement mechanisms from the federal government. But people don't really see it that way, right? So part of it is educating and making hospital privacy officers and risk management officers, I'm throwing out terms that are kind of like hospital administrative muckety mucks, to see that there is liability in having law enforcement come in to such an extent, maybe even framing it not so much as the prisoner who is with them, but to everybody else who's in this care setting. I also think that, so there's that avenue. I also think that there's a lot to be done in defining things more in the hospital space and using this, what I said, a whole host of regulations governing licensing of hospitals, licensing of medical providers, to really say, like, we have to be much more concrete and discreet about the ways in which we can allow law enforcement to affect this highly regulated space. And so another, besides like educating, I think one of the first steps that I've been doing is doing a lot of grand rounds. Like, I never ever thought I would ever go to med school, and I've been like at so many med schools doing grand rounds and at hospitals, and it's to get them to think about it, get medical schools to include it in their curriculum, and then get some legislation ultimately on the books that come at it from that side. Because as you can maybe tell, and perhaps even at this particular moment, crime reform or that kind of like cabining of law enforcement discretion may not be the most popular, even in a jurisdiction like California right now, but we can all still agree about how we might want to treat people who need care. And so how might that be a place where people can reach a compromise? And what I hope, ultimately what I'm thinking is like, there could have been two ways to go about this, right? Hospitals as carceral sites, but then hospitals influencing. Now, this is me taking like the most altruistic view of hospitals. I've also outlined all the ways in which hospitals have contributed to racial inequities. But if we take them at their most altruistic purpose, how is it that we can then inject that into a system that is so dehumanizing and have created so many problems that just ripple through our society? Thank you for your question, Kaylee.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's see, other questions from folks in the audience, in person? If not, I'm going to jump in with one.
I think
I think there is one. I'm sorry. And I will.
You might
sit
be a
tight.
little frozen, Professor Song. It's like sometimes your image is just a little
Yes.
frozen. But that's okay. We can hear you.
Yeah,
Okay.
the sound is perfect.
Sorry. Okay. Yeah, I'm in an old building. Sorry about that.
I just have a quick question of if you notice any differences in something like a state-owned hospital or provider versus privately owned institutions and their access to authorities or how they deal with this on a legal level or any other.
Yeah, and I think I can answer it in two ways. One, part of this is like a hospital issue. There's a lot of hospitals that are closing down in communities that really need access to medical care. Instead, private hospitals are opening in suburbs or richer communities, right? So you have some extent of like private institutions that really don't interface with this, right? They heavily gatekeep who comes in by virtue of their geography or by virtue of whatever else they're. But that doesn't mean that private institutions are ultimately off the hook, because what the key thing is proximity, right? So, and in terms of proximity, it doesn't matter whether you're a state institution, state-owned, county-owned, nonprofit, teaching hospital, or private. If you are close by and you are usually like a level 1 trauma facility, that tends to be the hospital that law enforcement gravitates to. And this is by virtue of like the needs, right? So they have the emergency departments that are fully staffed and able to take in trauma. Police agencies often like going to emergency rooms, and so do jails and prisons, because that they can go in and kind of like jump the queue, right? And so this has actually been studied in the sociological sphere, how that actually creates a ripple effects for everybody else waiting in the emergency room, because police officers and correctional officers are able to jump the queue. So there is a portion of private institutions, I think, that are out of this conversation, but that doesn't mean that they are not part of this other cadre of hospitals that are routinely used by law enforcement and other carceral authorities. Great question.
Other questions? So I have sort of a follow-up on that one, and that just has to do with the sort of funding or reimbursement structures for care for people who are in law enforcement custody, and whether there are variations or incentives built into those structures that might shape the conduct of healthcare providers or of institutions that are providing care.
No, and that's an excellent question, because there are interesting funding permutations here. So in most places, and I won't speak generally, I can't say for 100%, but when a person is incarcerated, the Medicaid doesn't follow them in, right? There are now certain exceptions made. But so, for example, in county jails, it's then the county that bears the cost. So this is when it becomes, there's, going back to Kaylee's question, there is an interesting point here, where you might want to incentivize hospitals, because, for example, there was this one investigation actually from a couple decades ago about a hospital in Santa Clara County here in California, where police officers were dropping off people who are inebriated, so drunk. They were being given care, but from the hospital's point of view, they were under law enforcement custody. Law enforcement custody said, we're not formally arrested them, so you're supposed, the hospital reimbursement is up to you. It's your responsibility. And I think that this actually comes up quite more, but there's a disconnect between what's happening in the ED space and with billing, let's say. And so there, I think there is an opportunity, but then there's also this kind of, on the flip side, perhaps more perverse incentives for hospitals to gain contracts. So like in New York City, Rikers Island, profound problems with their healthcare as well as their jail structure. So New York City, which already Bellevue and King's Hospital in New York City had already had jail units, but now New York City Health and Hospitals, which governs Bellevue and King's Hospital, has now contracts with New York City to provide all their jail care, right? So you now have then jails and prisons being like huge kind of the stakeholders, or like the people who are financially contributing to this institution. So yes, there's a lot of interesting complexities that go different ways when you think about the money and the economic questions here.
Great. This is so interesting. Let's see, other questions.
Question here in the room. Thank you so much for the talk. I was wondering what your opinion was on these newer programs that pair law enforcement officers with mental health professionals to respond to acute mental health crises, and whether you think those are, beneficial to patients, or they ultimately expand police power in a way that's, not great for everyone.
Yeah, and I think there's lots going on in that crisis care, crisis response. So I think up until a few years ago, that was the go-to, right? So like train police officers to also be attuned to mental health crises and crisis response. And there are good examples throughout this country of places where that decreased in mental health, people ending up in jails, because there's another kind of like permutation of like how hospitals get here, because sometimes hospitals actually call the police for mentally ill people who won't leave their facilities. And so they'll report them for trespass to law enforcement. So then law enforcement are kind of stuck in this quandary of like what to do when there's really no place for this person to go when they're in a state of mental health crisis. But I think that more and more people are seeing that perhaps we've leaned too much into law enforcement as the solution to this problem, right? And so you have now, there's federal legislation, something, well, I'm not sure how much you have heard about it, but instead of calling 911 for for emergency, for a mental health crisis, you call 988. And so with 988, you will be diverted. So like 911 calls, a lot of those call centers are located in police agencies actually. And so that's part of the reason why you have police going out to all these 911 calls, but it would completely divert it. And so it would go to a mental health crisis response center where people who are trained in behavioral health models and not a public safety model of dealing with mental health crisis control. Now there's funding issues attached to that. And I think for me, fundamentally, I think that it's kind of like someone, going back to, I can't seem to get away from medical analogies, but like I have this back problem when I was in DC and I go to this like spinal surgeon. He was like, okay, not me, but in the future, don't ever go to a surgeon with this problem because he's only going to recommend surgery. And so if you think about law enforcement, they have a certain number of tools in their toolbox, and one of them is inevitably going to be incarceration. And so if it at all possible, we can set up a system, and I think that this is where 988 is going. I think this is where a lot of jurisdictions are going, is to take, so okay, our preliminary reform step was to have law enforcement paired with behavioral response, but now can we do it so that we have behavioral response completely, and then creating discrete times when there are security and serious public safety interests when law enforcement can intervene? Thanks for that great question. Another question in here.
So I was wondering about what you were saying about police expanding role in the hospitals, because for a long time, particularly disability rights activists have been concerned that hospitals, for many people, have all along functioned as extensions of the criminal justice system, as extensions of imprisonment. And I just was on those lines, do you think that this is a more recent problem where we're seeing an increasing expansion into the hospitals, or has this invasion always been present? Has this been a long-term problem for decades, even hundreds of years?
Yeah, and so this is why I say that I build on the work of many people, including disability rights scholars, including like, I could talk about Foucault and David Rothman and other people who've talked about the conflation of spaces. And I think that what I'm trying to do is to like say it is actually a generalized problem, right? So when people have talked about it in terms of Black women who are reported by their doctors because of, child abuse or like fetal neglect, or you have people who are disabled who are further criminalized because of their disability, that the reason for that is that fundamentally these hospitals have become embedded into our carceral structures, right? And so if you are familiar with the work of carceral geographers like Ruthie Gilmore, is like to map out our carceral institutions completely. And then so going to your other question about like how long standing it is, it's an interesting, I think, historical point to see that the bureaucratization and kind of like expansion of law enforcement authorities coincided with the expansion of hospitals, right? You had hospitals building because of the Hill-Burton Act, and then also this expansion of emergency physicians and the importance of emergency rooms that happened also around the 60s and 70s. So when you go back, so I'm like I'm a former public defender, so I look back in case law. So if you go back and look at cases from like the 50s and 60s even, you see a lot of ways in which what I'm talking about, this like fluid interactions between hospital and law enforcement agency, the conversations between doctors and police are just in the facts. They're littered throughout the facts. And I think that's part of the reason when I was starting at the top with like how courts view this space. It's like courts have always viewed it in this way. And there has not been sufficient pushback, I think, from the criminal procedure angle to say that, well, no, we can't just treat this other entity that we've now established a whole other norms that they're trying to get better and just kind of assume that they're part and parcel of the criminal justice system. And so I think that's where, and I really appreciate your question, because I think that, yes, that is exactly like the point, that it has been left for certain groups completely, but we also have to recognize that this is like just kind of foundational to the way these institutions have developed. Thank you so much.
Can I ask a quick question, if I may? Professor Song, this is absolutely fascinating. I was just wondering, looking at this from the doctor's standpoint, and my impression has always been that doctors are terrified of liability, and they're, constantly subject to the paraphernalia of the medical management system, the risk management and other things. Makati, you were discussing it earlier. To what extent do those systems potentially mitigate some of the abuses that exist here? In other words, can hospital managers or the insurance concerns and the liability concerns come and get in the way of police intrusion to ensure that patients are given the kind of care that reaches a certain duty of care that doctors are supposed to provide? So, is there any pushback from the medical administration aspect of it and the liability aspect of it that, allows for some cushion against police intrusion into the medical setting?
And then this is related to my response to Kaylee, that I think there is room, right, in terms of privacy care, in terms of the example I gave, about punching a patient. I think if you had a really good personal injury lawyer who had been right there, that could take on a different kind of litigation bent, right? That liability then looks different. But there is something though that's very powerful about the badge. Probably the number one question I get at these grand rounds or even emails that are sent to me by doctors is that, can I get arrested? Because this police officer is threatening to arrest me. They're threatening to investigate me. How much of that is true? And so there's this end. And then from the hospital side, what I hear is, well, we need them though for our security. We need them there for all these other reasons. So there's this almost kind of fear that if we push back on the authority, that there will be some kind of negative repercussions. And so I think that so this liability push, and there's, I think then as future lawyers in the room, there's big room to flesh out, if you think about all the different ways that hospital liability exists apart from the law enforcement space, to flesh out all the different scenarios where that could, to counter, exactly as you said, to counter that kind of fear of the badge, right? And fear of something happening to actually their own security. And so I think, that's part of what I'm uncovering now, is that to what extent can you say there's privacy liability? What extent can you say that there's, part of it is that doctors and hospitals aren't really viewed as state actors. For those of you, who study state actors in the 1983 doctrine. And so then they're able to escape liability by and large, because the focus becomes just on the law enforcement, and hospitals kind of seem to get deleted from that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for one more question. So if there's anyone in the room with one last question for Professor Song, please just raise your hand. Jenny, do we have someone in the room? I can't see.
We do, just one moment.
Okay, thank you.
It's a long walk. You can be on screen.
This might be a good wrap-up question, but I appreciate how much work you've done in the field. I think it's really the only way to go about this is actually going to talk to healthcare providers. It was kind of alluded to with the previous question. There is or your answer to the previous question, there's this balance between healthcare providers feeling safe in their workplace and also providing an adequate level for sustaining or satisfying your duty of care as a healthcare provider. So from your perspective, if you were given the opportunity to maybe propose a patient's bill of rights, what are the 2 or 3 things you think that healthcare providers could really feel comfortable agreeing to in terms of establishing some sort of safeguards that ensure that they're providing sufficient level of care but still feel comfortable in their work?
And I think that's precisely, so I've been involved in this one with this one particular trauma surgeon who's really trying to do a ton in her own, pushing just really by herself against her administration. We've been coming up with all sorts of practical scenarios. We, did this toolkit that we think we can put, when you go into your lunchroom or something, there's those, your rights as an employee kind of thing, or what to do in the case of emergency. So things, but going to some practical, I think, immediate things the hospitals can do is to make a separate space for the law enforcement agents that come in. They have to come in for certain reasons. That I'm not disputing at all, and nobody would dispute that. But keep track of it. it is amazing to me how in a place where hospitals keep track of everything, and one of my RAs is now, he graduates from law school, goes to med school, and he's like, it's so funny. I realize now in the trauma bay, there's someone who's taking notes for everything that happens, right? But no one's taking notes when the police officer is asking questions, when the police officer is rummaging through pockets, when the police officer is taking cell phones of the patients, which I find really interesting. There's this way that police officers act as ghosts, right? They're both like everywhere and also invisible. And so I say, well, how about having one location, and just how about really attaching why a police officer is here to a patient for a discrete documented reason. And then secondly, it's so important to create patient care spaces. If a physician, there are so many instances where physicians were like, I don't feel like this patient is a danger to me. Maybe he's a danger to you because you and him have a different kind of adversarial relationship, but you can really step outside so I can have this confidential communication so I can better provide care. I was talking to in UCLA, they have like twin towers that they have a jail ED. And even when they're inside the jail, guards and shackles are present. And that seemed to make absolutely no sense to me. And so there's I think two very quick fixes, right? One is just kind of keep track of, and then maybe have one centralized location that doesn't bleed into patient care spaces, but also then to have the norm and some kind of protocol be established for how to balance this kind of individual safety problem and risk of flight with patient confidentiality, right? And so I think even in those two steps, which sound very small, could go send a voluminous message, right, to law enforcement authority that this is actually a place where medical providers are taking back their authority in these spaces. I also hear and I know we're ending, is that, law enforcement officers go to the person who's lowest on the totem pole when they want to have something done. They never go to the top trauma surgeon on the top because they have a lot of authority and they've already been around the block a number of times. They know what to say. They seek out the first year medical student or the intern to be able to get this. And that's the way oftentimes they circumvent what would otherwise be these hospital rules. But thank you very much for letting me articulate that. And thank you everyone for your great engagement. And I'm sorry about my tech issues, and I'm really just happy to be able to share my research today.
So Professor Song, I just want to, thank you on behalf of all of us for just a fascinating lecture. I've been here for an hour. I did not check my phone even once. This was just a remarkable tour de force. Your work is fascinating and important. And if folks in the room, if we could, give a quick shout out and a clap to Professor Song for being with us today and taking the time to give us your thoughts. It was just a wonderful, wonderful hour.
Thank you so much. Have a great, wonderful end of the semester, and everybody be safe and be well.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jenny.